Okay. So Janie, I thought that this installment of our video sessions could be about why it is that we have been emphasizing the community conversations
Yeah.
so much, and how yet again on the town hall on Saturday, we're doing more talk. And, I wonder just what kinds of assumptions we have that others in the community may or may not have about the importance of community conversations. What do you think about that as a topic?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I'm curious what your assumptions are, or what led you to ask that question.
Well, I guess listening to those conversations, I've come to the feeling that we have a conversational deficit, that we've been taking classes together, we've been, practicing together, but not talking enough. And often we've had kind of a leadership perspective that just says, do what Halifax says, which has worked for us. And then now there's nobody in Halifax, among other things, or there's less direction from our leadership.
Yeah,
And it's up.
So much is coming up. So much has been happening. So many questions have arisen that it's like we can, using our old forums for communication, we haven't been able to communicate enough to keep up with it all, I think.
Yes. And I think that there is an existential threat of just the loss of memberships. In fact, one angle here is that someone who's left the community, who was someone that I value so much, made a conversation when you and I had a beer with her that said, for trauma-informed care, or for taking care of people who have been through a traumatic experience, it's really important to explain what you're doing and why, and what the boundaries are. And I think that actually you and I have kind of forged ahead trying to have more community conversations without being completely accountable to our community. This is why, this is when it started, and this is when it might end. I don't know if it'll end or not. but that applies to each gathering, and it applies to our co-directorship.
I don't know if I completely agree in that with the community conversations, that was something that came up in conversation with Mark, Director of Societal Health and Wellbeing, and a task force that we put together of a number of people. There were 6 people involved from the community, and some people from outside of the community, or like ex-members, who sort of came up with some of the topics. And I feel like, at least in my perspective, the conversations have been very open and receptive, and we're not saying when the end date is, because we're going to continue doing it as long as it's working, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean,
well, but I guess the kind of trauma angle is that on some level our community has been traumatized by various experiences, some in Portland and some not. And I think that we owe it to ourselves and to each other to be as explicit as possible about what are we doing and why. And the other day we had a conversation about classes and study groups and all of that, and it really struck me, well, in some ways these community conversations are the answer. It's kind of like people coming together and saying, look, we're responsible for our path, we're responsible for our community, and unless we learn to talk to each other, even when we disagree or it's a painful conversation, we're not going to really work.
Yeah, and I think talking to each other is, I agree with you that that's so vitally important, and something that our community needs to do more and more. I also feel like that's just the first step. I mean,
Yeah,
or it's continuous, like don't forget the Hinayana. I mean,
exactly.
conversation is not equal to Hinayana, but in the same idea, they
It's
need to
analogous.
keep going. But then there's also this idea that in order for us to really be um, not a top-down um, organization alone, but be kind of a healthy community, um, we also need to have forums where the conversation leads to action and that there's community input on
Yeah,
decisions being made. And I think that's a reason why we need to have these town halls on a more regular basis.
yeah, yeah. And you know, I think
Town
you, yeah, and you keep pushing the idea that the town halls need to give evidence of change and evidence of action. And I think that really is important. You know, I tend a little bit more towards the, oh, let's keep talking forever. And you know, I think there are clear limits to my perspective as far as that's concerned.
and for me, it's not about evidence. Um, it's about having opportunity to make some decisions together,
Yeah,
having a place where the community can kind of have input on what we're doing. So
yeah.
it's not like, oh, prove it. It's like, you
Well,
know,
I think that's part
work
of the
together,
trauma.
create
The
a form of,
trauma angle is actually, you know, when there's that a traumatized person is kind of very sensitive to the difference between what's said and what's actually done.
yeah.
And so I think that if we're saying that we're listening to ourselves, then we need to really listen to ourselves and then act accordingly. And that's where that kind of integrity really comes in.
Yeah. And so for that reason, I mean, we're really still in a conversation phase. We're still kind of learning to communicate together. Um, but I also want our town halls to have um, time for proposals or kind of just our pitching ideas even to the
Right.
community and getting input. I
Also
think
have
with
to,
that, we're still a top-down organization.
they also have to be fun.
You got that one.
Okay,
Thank you, everyone.
bye. See you next installment.